What do you mean, $1? It's $23.50.
RoboCop Rogue City has been out for about a month and a half now. Critic reviews are decent, if a bit mixed. Fan reviews are glowing, we'll dig into why. But first, every time I think about this game, I think about this one moment. I was walking through the downtown Detroit hub area. It was overcast, almost no pedestrians around, and also no music. The only notable sound was RoboCop's loud, thudding footsteps, and it all had this almost perfect stillness to it, like a liminal space. You know that weird feeling you get when walking around on an empty multiplayer map? While thumping my way towards a distant objective marker, I saw flashing police lights outside of a courthouse, so I thumped my way over. The cop outside asked me to sort out a hostage situation, and in I went to be greeted by a typically visceral and destructive shootout. It's amazing. 0 to 100 in a second. You sort of just lumber around, tearing apart these beautifully modeled environments. Whatever gameplay depth these shootouts may lack, they more often than not make up for in pure feel. RoboCop's gun feels like a cannon, and he's a walking tank. I saved the hostages after a quick COD-style breach and clear, and I'd wager this game has more of those than all the COD games combined, and side quest complete, I moseyed back onto the street and just continued thumping my way through the eerie, quiet downtown. Just as we instantly went from 0 to 100, RoboCop Rogue City just slammed the brakes at 100 and brought things back down to 0. A quick adrenaline shot of a side quest. This game has some incredible highs and some lows that I want to bring up, and yet this fairly innocuous, completely skippable side quest that doesn't have any big story beats has stuck with me more than anything else. Maybe the fact that it's just a side quest with such good production values is part of why, like, it's a tight, fun little mission, but I think it stands out because it's in many ways emblematic of this entire game, of the highs and the lows. Sometimes RoboCop Rogue City feels incredibly polished and visceral, and other times it feels a bit underbaked and slow. It's very atmospheric throughout, and there's some whiplash as you transition between it being fast-paced and slow-paced, and at its best and at its worst. The new RoboCop game is surprisingly good, is a title that I'm considering for this video. It's a very mini-me title, I know, and I'm not sure if I'll go with it, but if I do, it feels a bit off because I'm not terribly surprised that this game is good. A Polish company named Teyon developed this, and their last game, Terminator Resistance, showed a degree of competency and a reverence for the Terminator IP that had me really looking forward to their RoboCop game. Terminator just didn't feel like a flash in the pan, it felt like a massive step forward towards even greater things. It was definitely a step forward from their random Rambo rail shooter at least, and so I expected Rogue City to at least be good. And I want to stress that it is good. Like, if you like RoboCop, you'll probably like this game, and every time I boot it up, I'm swept up by the atmosphere of it, and then I shoot a gun and just forget all my problems. Keep that in mind because I'm gonna dive into a bunch of things that I don't think are very good, and I think you'll understand why. But first, let's talk about those shootouts. My god. Being as slow as RoboCop is, you usually can't just duck into cover at a moment's notice, at least not until you get a dash upgrade, but even then it only lets you dash directly forward and it has a cooldown. So because you're almost always exposed to enemy gunfire, you have a lot of health, and it's all about quickly aiming rather than quickly positioning. Despite the cool UI with those big green targeting rectangles everywhere, this functions basically like every other FPS, maybe with a bit more aim assist. Aim with the left trigger, fire with the right. Movement this slow could be awful, but it's not, partly because it's also dazzling, but mostly because Rogue City throws dozens of enemies at you at once. Harkening back to Teyon's masterpiece Rambo, this can feel like a light gun game, as you sort of slowly thud forwards, shooting everything that moves in a symphony of debris and red mist. Part of why Time Crisis was such a cool game was because the guns visually damage stuff like this too, especially in Crisis Zone. Not enough people are talking about Crisis Zone. Rogue City is set between RoboCop 2 and 3. Peter Weller returns as RoboCop for the first time since RoboCop 2, barring some random cameos, and considering he's 76, he knocks it out of the park.
Do not move until I return.
Evoking those first two films is a real give the fans what they want thing. That big, brash, Reagan-era Hollywood 80s hyper-violence and bravado is wonderfully captured in Rogue City, and cheeky references to the films are strewn throughout. There's Sopranos' Road to Respect-esque novelty, what a game that was, in walking around the police station or the Omnicorp boardroom, and with the graphics being so good, this almost feels like a virtual set tour. Also, I was glad to see that RoboCop 2's Nuke is everywhere in this game. Who doesn't love Nuke? Paul Verhoeven's RoboCop isn't a film I need to introduce, so if you haven't seen it, 1, it's brilliant, go watch it, what are you doing? And 2, just know that it's a silly-looking, cheesy action film on the surface that's deceptively smart underneath. To be reductive, if you split RoboCop into 3 core themes that it balances, you have the macho, over-the-top action and violence, the usually comedic satirizing of corporate America and its military-industrial complex and privatization, capitalism stuff, and the guy named Alex Murphy who died and was rebuilt as a cyborg cop, human vs. machine, memory wipe, personal drama stuff. To be even more reductive, let's call these action, comedy, and drama. Make a mental note of these. No reason. RoboCop was a very self-contained film in a way that makes a sequel hard to pull off. RoboCop 2 basically resets RoboCop's character arc and goes again, but to be blunt, all the sequels to RoboCop are worse than RoboCop because they're dumber than RoboCop. Especially that 2014 remake. That's some dumb viewing. This game is also dumber than RoboCop to some degree, and it'd be shocking if it wasn't. There's just little chance it could have matched the first film's tight standard across the board, being a 15-ish hour mid-budget game up against a 100-minute Hollywood classic. Comparing them is unfair, in a way. That said, Rogue City is clearly dripping with a certain adoration for RoboCop, which I'm sure you can tell from the visuals. Rogue City is gorgeous. I found myself oogling at it all the time, and the aesthetic speaks for itself. There's a lot to be said about the heads-up display and the 80s CRTs and tech everywhere, but the realistic environments steal the show. Look at these rundown buildings. Look at this factory from the first film. Look at these interiors. And this is running in performance mode on a Series X at 1080p so that I could record it without massive file sizes. This isn't even on a specky PC. The character models aren't amazing, but, budget game. RoboCop himself looks great. Turns out when your characters look robotic, the robot guy comes off looking the best. Now, before we dive in further, I just want to say that I wrote a ton of notes for this review, way more than I normally do. It kind of felt like every 2 minutes I was picking up my pen to drop another thought on my notepad, and the reason for that is Rogue City is just full of stuff. This is one stuffy game, and this stuff is stuff that you've seen stuffed into other games before. Stuff's a good word, isn't it? You can get really granular with it and pick apart all the different stuff. You've got a skill tree, and some skills are clearly better than others. You've got an upgrade system for RoboCop's gun, which involves this minigame thing that feels like a bit of a waste of time, but you gotta do it for the cool upgrades, one of which makes the game more gory. You've got dialogue options, you've got those corny telltale they will remember that moments. You've got the breach and clears, some quests have branching paths, RoboCop has unlockable abilities, he can pick up other weapons other than his usual big pistol, which feels kind of weird for him. He has these scripted glitch out episodes where he flashes back to his family, like in the original films. Plenty of the original characters return, but some have different casting and likenesses. The news reporters are back, but they feel a lot more subdued here. There's collectible pickups, there's that big open hub downtown area, and you can issue parking tickets in it. I could go on just listing out stuff, but that's exhausting, and I'll stop saying stuff now. Essentially, Rogue City is a game that throws ideas at the wall, and if they don't stick, it gets out some glue. So as I attempt to boil down this surprisingly dense game into something more palatable, let's hone in on how this game adapts this IP. If RoboCop the movie is a balance of action, drama, and comedy, thanks for remembering, and if Rogue City is very obviously trying to emulate the old RoboCop films, then please enjoy a few subheadings. How Rogue City adapts RoboCop's action. Rather well, I'd say, but as pure and delightful as these shootouts are, they are a little overly simplistic, and it turns out making a RoboCop action game where you play as RoboCop has some unique challenges. In a way, RoboCop isn't a character that you'd design for a video game because in the films he's more or less indestructible, he borders on caricature, and he kind of just mindlessly walks around shooting bad bad guys, so playing the game on easy, you really feel like a borderline indestructible RoboCop. But play on hard and you'll find yourself slowly peeking around corners and doing your best to take cover to regen health like a Call of Duty game, which is more challenging and is more engaging, but then it no longer feels like a RoboCop game. At least not until you upgrade your health and damage and it all becomes too easy again, even on the hardest setting. Terminator Resistance was way too easy on launch too, but they ended up fixing that in a patch, so maybe that'll happen again here, but point is, when choosing a difficulty, you're kind of picking between the game being authentic to the films but bland to play over time on easy, and inauthentic but more fun on hard. On balance though, this is a pretty minor complaint because the action in RoboCop, I think, is worth playing the game to try out for yourself. It's just that fun, and it captures the spirit of the films remarkably well. How Rogue City adapts RoboCop's drama. The moment I found most touching was when RoboCop visited his partner Lewis in hospital while she was unconscious. He goes out of his way to visit her, but he doesn't break down emotionally when he gets there, whatever robotic beepy mess that would look like. He instead stands by the bed and updates her on the case, and I love this. It kind of just says everything it needs to. You know that Murphy is somewhere in that suit wanting to hug her and tell her it's all going to be okay, but being RoboCop, he's restrained to just talking about work. On the other hand, a moment that didn't click was a side quest that saw RoboCop and his friends help out a kid with his morals and the future and the passing of his dad with a drawn-out talk about why you should be a good person, and not only did it have my eyes glazing over, it's very detached from the usual cynicism of RoboCop. This is the franchise that had a kid as a villain running a drug empire after all. For the most part, the writing here sits somewhere in between these two extremes. There's a very workman-like, video gamey feel to how this dialogue is written, and story beats are rarely shocking where they'll rehash famous moments. Ed 209 malfunctioning, family flashbacks, the Mayor vs. Omnicorp, Delta City trying to make better versions of RoboCop, you know, RoboCop stuff. And of course, you'd expect and hope for RoboCop stuff in a RoboCop game, but you also expect some wild concepts and shocking moments, and this only has glimpses of those. Where it does surprise is the fact that it has dialogue options. For anyone who's seen the films, you can almost instinctively tell there's something a bit funny about RoboCop having dialogue options. Like, he only really acts out on his own in the films when something triggers an intense emotional response, like he'll try to track down his family after being reminded of them, or he'll get revenge on the guys that killed him. Otherwise, he's just blindly following the 3 prime directives programmed into him. So for RoboCop the character to take a moment to make more subtle, nuanced decisions for every random side quest is kind of wild, and it initially suggests that Rogue City embraced the original film's ending in a way that RoboCop 2 didn't. Like, RoboCop has embraced that he's Alex Murphy now, that he's human, and he's willing and able to make subtle human decisions. But then a lot of the decisions are basically, do you want to be a big, mean, dumb robot, or do you want to be an empathetic human? You're sort of choosing between role-playing as either RoboCop or Alex Murphy. There's even a somewhat clumsy therapy session subplot where the therapist basically asks RoboCop if he feels like a human or a robot over and over, and you get to choose your responses. So the question kind of becomes, does this game move past the human versus robot identity crisis thing or not? And the answer is kind of up to you, but also not really. Early on, RoboCop gets a monitoring chip installed, and maybe the writers could have used that monitoring chip as a plot device that reprograms RoboCop's conflict handling, like in RoboCop 2, but instead it indeed just seems to be a basic monitoring chip that serves to reward you with experience points after each chapter, somehow. Maybe I missed some readable note lying around that explains everything and this point kind of becomes moot, but the dialogue choices being a thing in this game doesn't seem to be justified internally, if that makes sense, or at least not very well. Like, there's no strong justification for why RoboCop can choose his responses like this, and frankly, I don't like doing a lot of character analysis stuff like this because it all feels like conjecture. Like, you know, maybe he always made decisions like this, and I'm happy to hand-wave RoboCop having dialogue choices, down to it simply being a decision that the designers thought would be fun and interesting. You know, it's not like having dialogue choices is a hard pill to swallow or something I can't get past. In fact, it can be rather fun goofing around with the dialogue, but all too often, choosing between being a lawman RoboCop or a good guy Murphy is very very arbitrary, and it often undermines the tension between Alex Murphy's internal struggle and the therapist's scenes about that internal struggle when he can just decide to be a great guy all the time, which leads me to subheading 3. How Rogue City adapts RoboCop's comedy. Imagine the first film, except RoboCop can make nuanced moral decisions. It's weird, right? It undermines the themes, but, let's not dwell on this point further because you get it by now, and Rogue City has some great gags and one-liners in it.
We won! So smile! Okay, don't smile. Creeping me out.
You'd have to break down this hardened door if you want to get in.
That will not be a problem.
With this buggy brain of yours, you think you still remember how to put the heat on them scumbags?
I prefer to serve justice cold. It seems there will be trouble.
At its best, the dialogue and story beats do a great job of capturing that wonderful Verhoeven cheesiness. Like, for example, there's a scene late in the game where a firefight breaks out inside a weapons convention, and it's very on-brand and very Verhoeven, but notice how I strung those gags earlier together with a montage. There's a montage in the film where RoboCop is sorting out street crimes, and it's very over-the-top and absurd, but imagine if that montage wasn't a montage and it showed long stretches of travel in between jokes, alongside more sincere storytelling that can be rather dry, even bordering on overly self-serious and earnest, like that kid's scene from earlier, and you kind of get a picture of what Rogue City can be like. There's a major multiple side mission subplot about an unconfident rookie joining the Force where you can either bully him or compassionately help him integrate, and it's mostly played pretty straight. It's not even a bad subplot, like it has this cute moment where you save a cat, and I did find myself bonding with and caring about this rookie a little bit, but it loses focus on the satirical or comedic side of RoboCop, and if this was the only plotline like this, I wouldn't be pointing it out, but so many are like this, and while they're all fairly decent, I remained engaged enough with the storytelling in Rogue City without ever feeling super hooked. This more conventional style of storytelling wouldn't feel out of place in a Far Cry game or a Bethesda game, and it felt more appropriate in Teyon's own Terminator game too, because Terminator's stories are more earnest, but in RoboCop it just doesn't click quite as well. Take the few Ed 209 boss battles. Like, Ed 209 is sort of a joke of a mech. Like, RoboCop defeats one in the film by walking down a set of stairs, which is amazing, It sort of represents the failings of that corporate tech move fast and break things attitude, but in the game they're framed as big, genuine, scary boss battles. Fair enough, why not? They are quite scary, but I cheesed every single one of these boss battles on my first try, on the hardest difficulty, by hiding behind a basic piece of cover that it couldn't seem to navigate around. With some clever writing, this could have come off as part of the joke. Maybe Ed 209 could say a line about how it can't bend down to shoot me or something, but instead it's all played straight, so these just come off as nothing more than poorly designed boss battles. To wrap up my point here, Rogue City does satirize the same things as the films, and the writing and the humor can be delightful, but it always feels like it could go further, like it could be more clever about it, and its more subdued and sincere tone overall, in effect, makes it all feel less cynical and less satirical. It's more of a straightforward story about a robot cop taking down the bad guys than a biting satire, and that doesn't quite sit as comfortably for RoboCop. Thankfully, the combat just being so joyful and so extreme and so over the top brings a lot of much needed levity. It's like every single cool thing in Rogue City has a little asterisk next to it, like a little bit of fine text. The comedy can be great, but the satire doesn't fully land. The more dramatic moments can be very emotional, but they can also be very bland. I didn't mean for that to rhyme. The combat is usually fantastic, but the difficulty balance isn't quite right. And you can even get really granular with this. You can throw a butt on the smallest of things. That's a weird sentence. The gun upgrades are awesome, but the minigame to get them isn't. The hub area is beautiful and a treat to be in, but it's weirdly underpopulated, and the slow walking can be a chore when objectives are far away. I have a theory you were meant to be able to drive a car at some point. The good stuff does outweigh the bad stuff. It far outweighs the bad stuff, but I want to highlight the bad stuff for reasons. If you're listening along to my ramblings here in this YouTube video, thinking that I'm being super nitpicky and should just switch my analysis brain off and enjoy the game for what it is because it's clearly a love letter to RoboCop developed by a smaller team with less funding, then backspace the comment you've just typed out about it because I agree. RoboCop Rogue City is a really cool game, a super cool game. I am being nitpicky, and I'd recommend this to any RoboCop fan in a heartbeat. It's truly a delightful game in so many ways, and the firefights and the atmosphere alone are worth the price of admission if you're into this sort of thing. The reason I'm being Mr. Grumpy about this is mainly because RoboCop Rogue City is unbelievably, frustratingly close to knocking it out of the park. It's teetering on the edge of being something truly great. It flashes moments of brilliance far more often than you'd expect. You know, the hospital scene, the shootouts, the jokes, the environments, but the baggage to it all is like a ball and chain, just dragging down a game that's clamoring to be set free. There's a sentiment online surrounding this game that I've seen that sort of frames it as a throwback to the dumb fun licensed PS2 game, and I love those, so to a point I agree. Like, treat it that way and you'll have a good time because it's filled with fun nods and it's passionately put together. It's a real crowd pleaser, but RoboCop wasn't a dumb film, and this game being surprisingly slow-paced with lots of walking around chatting to NPCs in hub areas, accompanied by fairly arduous detective bits that I've yet to mention that sort of signpost the things that you need to hold down the scan button on over and over. It's a game that really asks for your patience, and it makes a case for being a smarter, more considered RoboCop game. On that front, it doesn't often succeed. The pacing is all over the place, and there are a handful of times I was quite bored playing this. Only a handful, and I almost didn't want to admit that I was bored playing this because its highs are so amazing, and I knew that at any moment another amazing courthouse-esque shootout could just break out, which pulled me through. It's as if an editor needed to come in, cut the fat, rewrite a bunch of dialogue and scenes, and this really could have been something amazing. That's no small task, I know, but the bones are there. Maybe gluing everything to the wall wasn't such a good idea, but I just really want these highs to be capitalized on. Like shootouts in the video store, or the arcade, or the Detroit hub area when it's half on fire and riots are breaking out, or in the Omnicorp Tower, are incredibly visceral and so RoboCop. If only that quality was matched across the board. As it stands, this is primed for a sequel. There's an underdog story to RoboCop Rogue City that endeared me to it before I even played it. It's a mid-budget game that strives to faithfully recreate a fairly dormant and beloved IP, and if you go in knowing that, or as a big fan of the films, you're likely going to have a great time just shooting up the place, seeing these aesthetics beautifully brought to life, and hearing Peter Weller call people creeps again. This is exactly the kind of mid-budget project I want to see more of out of this industry, and Teyon are teetering closer and closer to making something truly great, closer to taking that next step. But for now, they've released a solid RoboCop game that, while flawed, is hard not to appreciate.
Drop it, scum.
And there we wrap up the video. Thank you for watching. If you're new here, hi, welcome. My name's Peter, or mini-me. Call me by my gamer tag, please. Yeah, subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Do all the algorithm stuff. It helps out. Yeah, thank you to my patrons. I also have a review of Terminator Resistance, which was Teyon's previous game, which I reviewed when it came out. So if you want to check that out, I'll link it somewhere. But otherwise, thank you to all the patrons coming up on the screen. And yeah, take care of yourselves. Goodbye.